Stop relying on trading gurus to tell you which trading strategies are profitable. Let the computer do all of that for you. I created this expert advisor in MetaTrader specifically for this purpose. Within MetaTrader, simply select this expert advisor, select the optimization option, and select not only the indicator parameters, but the actual indicators themselves that you wish to test. The optimizer will then run through every single combination of indicators and indicator parameters and will find the ones that perform the best. But does this actually work? Well, it does, and it works extremely well, but only if it's done correctly. And we'll be going through some tips and tricks throughout today's tutorial. So before we start, it is important to mention that today's tutorial is going to follow along from our previous tutorials that we have done within MetaTrader. Now, this is the only time you're going to be hearing me say this, but I'm going to give you a full exemption from watching my previous tutorials just for today's episode. In other words, if you haven't watched my previous tutorials, then that is completely fine, because I think today's tutorial is too good to put on hold for you to catch up on my previous videos. As such, in today's tutorial, we're going to be starting off with the exact same code of our expert advisor and our indicator library that we coded up in our last tutorial. And I'm going to show you exactly how to get that code from my GitHub, so then that way you're up to date with the most recent code. However, of course, I do recommend that if you haven't watched my previous tutorials, then after this video, you go back and watch my previous videos, so then that way you get a full understanding of the expert advisor and indicator library that we are using today. Now, obviously, if you have followed along from my previous tutorials, you will already have the expert advisor and indicator library set up, so you can of course skip this first part of the tutorial. So I'm really excited to be sharing with you today's video because it's something that I haven't seen done on YouTube or really on the internet, and I feel like it opens up a whole world of possibilities that you will be able to see eventuate as we go through today's tutorial. So that's all the formalities out the way. Let's get stuck into our expert advisor and start making these possibilities a reality. All right, so of course with MetaTrader open, we're going to go to File, New File, Expert Advisor from Template. Next, we're going to name our expert advisor. Of course, we're going to call it multi-symbol indicator EA, but this time we're using version 2.01. I'm going to go next, finish, and that creates our expert advisor. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is go into my GitHub, and of course, we are going to go into the MetaTrader strategies repository. That's going to open, and I'm going to go to multi-symbol EA, multi-symbol indicator EA. And this is what we coded up in our last tutorial, multi-symbol indicator EA version 1.02. So if I open that, this is the code that I am going to copy over into our expert advisor. And this is where we're going to start off with in this tutorial. I'm going to scroll to the bottom, copy this, switch across. Going to highlight everything from the name down. Going to delete all of that and then paste in the code I've copied across from my GitHub. Scroll back to the top and just fix that up. There we go. And if we've copied everything across correctly, we're going to compile. That looks like that has compiled, and that's all good. So I'm going to do the same thing now for the indicator library that we created last time as well. So we're going to go to File, New File, and this time we're going to go into Library and create the new indicator library. Hit Next. We're going to name our indicator library. Of course, exactly the same as our last episode. We're going to call it Indicator Library. Now, we're not making any changes here, so we're going to keep the same naming convention. Finish, and we have created our indicator library. Same thing, now that I'm back in GitHub, we're going to go back into MetaTrader strategies. We're going to go to libraries now. And this is our indicator library. And we're going to be using indicator library version 1 patch 3. And we're going to open this up. And again, we're going to copy all of this information. Going to highlight everything, copy that. That's all highlighted. And I'm going to go back across to Meta Editor. And again, I'm going to highlight everything below the name, remove all of that, paste that in. And scroll back to the top and clean this up. There we go. And this should compile if I've done it correctly. Perfect, everything compiles. Again, if you followed along from my last video, you will get some warnings within this particular library, but that's okay. Everything will process completely fine. So that is our indicator library setup, as well as our expert advisor setup from our last tutorial. And so this should operate exactly the same as where we left off in our last video. Now we are all up to date in where we left off in our previous tutorial. So now we can start making the necessary changes to our current expert advisor. Now the main thing we're going to be doing today is creating enumerations for each of our indicators that we want to be optimizing, mainly our entry 1, filter 1, and filter 2. Now an enumeration, or enum for short, will allow us to create basically a drop-down list that we'll be able to select within our expert advisor's settings within MetaTrader, the indicator as well as the indicator parameters that we wish to use. And no doubt as we progress through today's tutorial, I'm sure you're going to see the benefits unfold. So let's go back onto our computer, but before we go into the code, let's go into MQL5's documents on their website to get a better understanding of what enums actually are. So now within MQL5's docs, there is a write-up for enumerators, which we are going to be using so that the user or Metatraders Optimizer is able to select the specific indicator and the parameter that the user or the optimizer wishes to use. Now there's an easy to understand example, which is as follows, where we have a variable called months, which is defined as a enum type. Now this variable months is able to take in the following values, which is of course the months of January through to December. So this is the exact same concept that we are going to be using. However, instead of specifying the months, we're going to be specifying the indicator and its parameters that we wish to use. So with that concept understood, we're going to go back to our expert advisor and start coding in our expert advisor updates. Of course, the very first thing I want to do is change the commentary. So we're now using version 2. And I'm also adding in the following comment, which is the EA will use enums so that the user can select the indicator and the parameters, which we have just discussed. We of course are on version 2, but now patch 1. And scrolling down to the strategy conditions, I just want to add one bit of clarification for this particular expert advisor, which is as follows, that the exit trigger is also the same indicator as our filter indicator number 1. Again, this is the same concept that we used in our last tutorial. However, I've just added in this code just for a clarification. We of course are using version 2.01 for this particular expert advisor. So now with our comments updated, we can go down to the section of the code that we are going to be adjusting, which is our indicator setup section. So just as a really quick recap from our last video for this indicator setup section, we have here 4 indicators, being our indicator entry 1, which is our trigger. We've got our filter indicators 1, we've got our filter indicators 2, and we've got our exit indicator. We have the input string for our indicator E1, which has the default value of our MACD. We have our input string for our filter 1, which has the default value of EMA. Input string for our filter 2, which has the default value of NA, meaning that we don't want to use an indicator, so we're using the NA indicator. And notice here for our exit indicator, we do not have a input value defined. It is just taking the string as defined by indicator X1, which is equal to our indicator filter 1. And that is because our indicator exit is also the same as our indicator filter 1. So what does that mean? That means that we need to create 3 enums for our entry trigger 1, our filter 1, and our filter 2. And of course, we don't need a specific enum for our exit 1, as we are going to be utilizing the same indicator as our F1. So to do this, what I'm going to do is scroll up a little bit, and I'm going to add in a new section called indicator string setup. So with this new section set up just above our indicator setup section, this is where we're going to populate our enums for each of our indicators. So as mentioned, we've got 3 indicators that we are going to be specifying enums for our entry 1, filter 1, and filter 2. And the next thing we need to do is define our enum variable, which I have done for each of our indicators. These variables, which I have identified in capitals, being indicators E1 is defined as a enum, and of course we've got indicators F1 and indicators F2. Now within each of these enums, we of course have brackets, and this is where we're going to populate within the brackets that the user can select for this particular expert advisor. So the very first indicator I want to define is of course the NA indicator, so that the user can select whether they want to use a particular indicator for the particular condition of the expert advisor. So this is very easy to do. We just simply specify NA for each of our indicator enums as shown. So the user can select the NA indicator for each of the particular indicator conditions selectable from our expert advisor. Of course, the next thing we want to do is actually add in some indicators that we can test. And you might recall, if I scroll down, our very first indicator that we did identify through our previous tutorial is the MACD indicator. And so I'm going to use that same indicator with the same conditions and the same parameters as shown. So very easy to do. All I'm going to do is copy this code, go back to our indicator string setup section. Under our enum indicators E1, I'm going to add in our code. Now all I need to do so that the expert advisor can differentiate between the different selectable options is put in a comma as shown. And so the user can now select either the NA indicator or the MACD using conditions A, 12, 26, and 9. If I compile this, this should compile. That works. And I'm going to do the same thing for our filters one. So if I scroll down, I have conveniently already got the code here for our indicator filter 1 being our EMA for conditions A 200. I'm going to go back up and go to our indicators F1 and simply paste in that code. Now, of course, we are not using a indicator for indicators F2, so we're just going to keep that as the NA indicator. I'm going to compile this, and that compiles. Now we have defined our enums for each of our indicators E1, F1, and F2. The last thing I want to do is put in a input option for each of these enums so that the user can actually select the enum options. So all I need to do is create a new input variable, and this input variable is using the enum that we have just defined, indicators E1, which is the same variable as defined above, and this is mapping to the new variable name called input enum E1 that I've just created. I can now do the same thing for our indicators F1, where I have defined the following variable called input enum F1, using indicators F1 as the enum that we have just defined. And of course, this is a type input. And finally, I can do the same thing for our filters 2, where I have defined again the following variable called input enum F2, using the enum indicators F2, which I have defined above. And again, this is a input function. If I compile this, this all compiles, and so that works. So it's as easy as that. We have created our enums for each of our indicators that we want to be optimizing, being our entry 1, filter 1, and filter 2 indicators. And in theory, if we were to go into MetaTrader itself, the input options of those enums being a drop-down list would actually be there. However, what we need to do now is take those newly created inputs that we have just created for each of our indicator enums and map them to the existing expert advisor code, so that way our expert advisor knows which indicators we have selected using those enums that we've just created. So let's go back into our expert advisor and map out our indicator enums to our indicator conditions. So now with our indicator enums set up, what we need to do is now map these indicator enums to our indicator code that we've created in our last tutorial, because this section, our indicator section area, is what actually is used within our Expert Advisor for us to take trades, to set up the handles, to exit trades, all based off the indicators as specified above. So this is quite simple to do. All we need to do is map our indicators E1, F1, and F2. Instead of our indicators E1 being equal to the input variable as defined over here, these are simply going to be equal to the enums that we have just defined above. So all we need to do for our entry 1 indicator, for example, is go back to our indicator string setup section, go to our entry 1 indicator, and where it's got our input indicators E1, we want to copy this bit of code, input enum E1, and go back down here and then change this to input enum E1. Now, of course, we've already specified that this was a input as defined by the enum above. So this now does not have to be a input. So I can remove that and I can bring these back as well to make that a bit cleaner. And now if I go to compile, that does compile with no errors. However, I do get a warning. And this warning says here that there is a conversion warning for our indicators E1 to string, which our indicators E1 is a enum. So the final thing we need to do here is actually do a conversion function, which is enum to string. And this will ensure that the appropriate conversions are done so that way our indicators E1, which is of course the variable that the rest of our Expert Advisor will use to again populate trades, set up the indicator handles, exit trades and the like. We need to make sure that we are using this conversion function to convert our enum that we have just created above to the appropriate format. So we can do the same thing for the rest of the code. So instead of the following code here being input string F1 equal to the following code, we simply map this to our enum that we just created, which is as follows. I remove this. That now sets that up. And then we do the same thing for our filter 2. So I've removed the previous code and removed the input previously and added in our appropriate enum and conversion function. And finally going down to our indicators exit 1 variables. Fortunately, we don't have an input function here, so I can backspace all of this just to clean it all up. And just for consistency, although this will compile with no issues at all, what I want to do is, instead of this being equal to indicators F1, I want this to be equal to the enum that we have created as well, just so the code's consistent above. So our exit indicator is going to be equal to the enum to string conversion of the input enum F1. If I compile all this, this fully compiles. We now don't have any warnings. So in theory, this should work exactly the same as what we have done previously. However, we now have selectable inputs of our enums for each of the indicators as shown above. Now, just as a bit of a recap, what we have done thus far is we've taken the code from our GitHub and created our Expert Advisor and indicator library. We've created enums for our entry 1, filter 1, and filter 2 indicators, and we've mapped those enums to the existing indicator conditions within our Expert Advisor. Now this is enough for us to actually test out whether our Expert Advisor with our new upgrades from our enums actually works. So what we can do is go into MetaTrader itself and actually try out our newly created Expert Advisor. So now that we're in MetaTrader, we're going to select our Expert Advisor, being our multi-symbol indicator EA version 2.01. Now we've got the same date range as previous, and I've got visualization mode selected. I'm going to go into the input section of our EA. And we can see here that we have, similar to before, our three options: input enum E1, F1 and F2. And note here that these are now our enums. And we have here our values for those enums, which by default is NA. I can actually click on this now by double clicking, and I can now select, using the enum or the drop down list, the particular indicator I want to trade. So this is, for example, the MACD A conditions 12.26.9 that we had by default previously. And for our enum filter one, I've got here the option to select our EMA A200. Now notice here for our filter 2, we've got nothing there to select because we are not using that, or we don't have any code for that particular indicator. I've selected the indicators I want to trade. The last thing I want to do is actually go to our multi-symbol functionality, and if you followed along from our previous tutorial, I can actually remove all of that and just go current, and that will trade the current symbol selected, which in this instance is Euro USD. And I'm going to go start. So we can see here that the Expert Advisor started with no problems. We see here that we've got the MACD, of course. We also have our exponential moving average, which is shown here. We've got here all the Expert Advisor commentary, which is shown above. And just to quickly go to the journal, I can see here that we've got the particular Expert Advisor indicators set up appropriately. Where we've got here, we are processing one symbol, which is our Euro USD. We've got here the MACD, which has been set up as the MACD for conditions A using parameters 12, 26 and 9. And that has been created successfully as handle number 10, which is exactly the same as what is being shown above here. Entry 1, which is our indicator handle number 10, which is shown. We've got here our EMA as well, that has been successfully created for conditions A using a period of 200. And that is being identified as handle ID 11, which is shown here for our filter 1. And note here that we're using the NA indicator as well for filter 2. And so that's been created as handle ID 0, and that's NA. And of course, our exit indicator being the same indicator as our filter 1, that is using the same handle. And so that is going to take exits based on our exponential moving average of 200. So this is exactly the same code as what we have done previously in our last tutorial. However, I just wanted to show you that the code is working exactly the same, even though now we've changed the code to use enums. So what I can do now is just make sure that the code is working correctly by testing some trades. And you might recall this is the same symbol and same period. And so this should be the same trades as what we were taking last time, which fortunately enough, we had a trade that actually entered on the very first candle of this particular date range. And so what I can do is cycle through some of the strategy. And we can see here that worked fine. As per the conditions of our trading strategy, we entered where there was a bearish crossover above the 0 line, which was the conditions that we coded up in our last tutorial. We're also taking short trades when price is below the exponential moving average, which met our conditions at the time of the MACD trigger, so we entered short. We then exit the trade when there was an opposite signal of a crossover of price and the exponential moving average, so we exited the trade. Again, these are all conditions that we coded up in our last tutorial, and if you want to see specifically how those conditions were coded up, I recommend going and watching that tutorial. If I close this, I can of course test multi-symbol functionality, where if I wanted to test all 28 currency pairs, I can simply, in the input function of the all tradable symbols, put in the 28 currency pairs, which I've just copied and pasted into the input section. I won't use visualization because that will take too long. And what I can do is perform a back test. Now, while this is thinking, you'll recall that this, if done correctly, should not be profitable, because that is what we found in our last tutorial, that this is not a profitable trading strategy, unfortunately, where this does lose money over time. So now if you are following along from our previous tutorial, you would know that we coded up some alternative conditions for our MACD indicator and our exponential moving average. Essentially what we wanted to explore in our last tutorial is what would happen if we actually took the opposite signals. So if our signals said to go long, well, why don't we go short? Why? Because, well, why not? Let's just try it out. And so what we did was create alternative conditions within our indicator library where the initial conditions were denoted by the letter A and our alternative conditions were denoted by the letter B. Now, if that doesn't make too much sense because you haven't watched my previous tutorial, then bear with me, that's completely fine. Just note that there is alternative condition options within our indicator library. And again, I would recommend that you go watch my previous tutorial so that way you can better understand what's going on here. However, nonetheless, you'll still be able to follow along and continue on in today's tutorial, and you'll be able to catch up in my previous tutorials at a later date. Now, of course, fortunately enough, we have those alternative indicator conditions for our exponential moving average and our MACD already coded up within our indicator library that, of course, we completed in our last tutorial. So all we need to do is adjust some bits of the code, which we're going to do now. So let's head back into MetaEditor itself and add in alternative indicator conditions. Now, unfortunately, unlike last time, if we wanted to test how the trading strategy would perform if we took opposite signals, where we coded the opposite trading signals as conditions B instead of conditions A, I cannot do that within the input section over here as the enum has not been set up with the appropriate dropdown. However, what I can do is simply go to the code and make the changes directly in the code, where I can also add in the following option where the user can select either conditions A or conditions B as shown. Likewise, I can do the same thing for our EMA, where the user now can select conditions A or conditions B for the EMA, and I can go compile. And now going back into MetaTrader, and going into our input enum E1, I now have that option of using the MACD B12269, which just takes the exact opposite signals as what we would compared to our previous example. So what I can do is delete all of this, go to current again, I'll go visualization on, and I can perform another backtest. And we can see here that the Expert Advisor has now been set up using the opposite signals, where previously this was a short trade, now we are actually going long. And if I play this out, this has now exited the long trade on the exact same conditions, but again, using the opposite signals. If I close this and now again test this for all 28 currency pairs, and taking off visualization, I can see here that the equity curve looks very similar to previous, however it's going in the other direction, showing the power of taking the opposite signals for this particular strategy and Expert Advisor. Now what I'm going to do for the remaining of this tutorial is actually commit to taking opposite signals. So I'm going to go back to the code and I'm going to remove MACD conditions A and EMA conditions A, compile this, and so if I went back into MetaTrader, I've only got the options for the NA indicator or the MACD conditions B, or the NA indicator or the EMA conditions B for the particular Expert Advisor. So now this is really good. We have created the foundation of this Expert Advisor, and now it's going to be super easy for us to add, well, new indicator parameters, which is what we're going to be doing now. So we're going to add in some alternative indicator parameters for our MACD and our exponential moving average. So let's go back into MetaEditor itself and code up those additional parameter conditions. So now back into our MetaEditor code for our Expert Advisor, we're going to add in some more options within our enums so the user can now select different indicator parameters. So simply all we need to do for this example, let's say it's our MACD, all we need to do is add in different parameter values. So previously we showed what we can do by changing the entry conditions for our indicator. We can do the same thing, but of course change our indicator parameters. And what I've done is simply added in the following code, and these are just some alternative MACD parameter values that are commonly used across the trading industry, where we are now using the MACD using the same conditions, but now using a fast period of 5, slow period of 35, and then a signal line of 5. And then we've got the same thing using a 8, 17, 9, 10, 25, 5, 13, 21, 8, and 15, 30, 8. And so now the user not only can select, well, the NA indicator, the MACD default parameters, but also alternative parameters as well for the MACD. We can do the same thing, of course, for our exponential moving average, where I've added in the following code, where we now have the option that the user can select EMA 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 150, 200, which was there previously, and now 250. If I compile this now compiles, and note I don't have to change any other bit of the code. All I need to do is specify the enums that I want to use. In this particular case, I'm still keeping our indicator F2 as the NA indicator. So now we've got those additional parameters for our MACD and exponential moving average. We can now go back into MetaTrader itself with the Expert Advisor updated and select now alternative parameters for those two indicators. So let's go into MetaTrader and see how that performs in a backtest. Now we're back in MetaTrader itself and we are back where we left off. With our updated code, we have, of course, our same options being our entry 1, our filter 1, and filter 2. However, now with our updated code, we can now double click on the drop down menu and we now have our additional parameters for our MACD, where we're still using our MACD indicator for conditions B, but now we have alternative parameters. I can easily select any parameter that I want. And likewise with our exponential moving average, we now have an exponential moving average of 10, 20, 30, 50. You've of course got 200 as per before. But let's say I just wanted to select these parameters and see how they would perform. If I was to start a test, we can see here now that unlike previously with the alternative MACD parameters, we do not start off this particular test with a trade. I'll need to cycle through and there we go. We get our first trade, which is extremely hard to see in this example. It must have triggered just near the 0 line. I would assume that that's correct. And so we've entered a trade. And we can see here that it then exits the trade at a win when the price did cross, of course, above the exponential moving average. If I go to our journal just to where the indicators were set up, we can see here that the MACD was set up for our Euro USD, of course, using conditions B of the parameters 10, 25, and 5. And same thing with our EMA, using EMA conditions B of 100. So of course, it's exactly the same code, exactly the same functionality and indicator setup, however now with alternative parameters. Out of curiosity, we can perform a back test again on all 28 currency pairs. And with visualization off, I can perform a back test. And I can see if this particular set of parameters, not only for the MACD, but also for the exponential moving average, performs any better. And by the looks of it, it does not. I think previously we made about $7,000 net profit. We've only made about $3,000. However, it's a bit tedious to actually go in and select each one by one and test out each individual parameter and its conditions separately. what we can do, of course, is do an optimization. And performing an optimization is exactly where the power of this particular expert advisor and trading library comes in. Now, the previous EA that we coded up in our last tutorial and the same EA that we started coding with in today's tutorial has some limitations when it comes to optimization. Yes, the user is able to select through the input options the type of indicator, indicator conditions, and indicator parameters that they wish to use, but they are not able to do an optimization. However, now we've made the necessary changes within our expert advisor where we've utilized enums, or basically a drop-down list, so that not only the user can select the indicators and the indicator parameters that they wish to use, but now the optimizer within MetaTrader can select those very same indicators as well. And this is where we can now perform an optimization with this particular expert advisor. So now I'm super excited to be sharing with you this next step of the tutorial, because we can now see how the optimization will work for this type of expert advisor. So let's go into MetaTrader itself and start playing around with the optimization. So as shown, we can simply go through the drop-down menu and select the parameters that we want to trade or we want to test. However, it is very tedious to go through one by one and do a back test on each one individually. So what we want to do is go into our settings and actually go to our optimization settings and select slow complete algorithm. And what this slow complete algorithm will do is test each possible combination of strategies based off the combination of indicators for our entry one and our filter one. All we need to do is click on the little box over here, and this will select that we want to optimize our particular trading strategy for all 28 currency pairs using a fixed lot size of 0.1 lots for our entry one and filter one. All we need to do is specify the starting point, which the starting point will be our first value of our enum, and then the end point, and then the stop point will be our last value of our enum. Likewise, we're going to do the same thing for our input enum F1, and it's going to be the stop point for our EMA 250. So with that selected, I can see here that based off these possible options, which there are 7 possible options for our entry one, 9 possible options for our filter one, there are in total 63 possible options altogether. So what I can do is run a optimization. Now this is going to test the performance of each of these options using a target of Sharpe ratio, which is what I like to use, or you can use profit factor as well, because we are using fixed position size. And we can see here within 17 seconds, we were able to test 63 different possible trading strategies using the different combinations of indicator parameters that we have defined in our enums to see which ones showed the best results for, in this case, Sharpe ratio. So we can see here that if we used any of these possible combinations, then we would actually have a fairly profitable trading strategy with a decent Sharpe ratio. And if I scroll down to the bottom, we can see here if we used any of these possible combinations, we can see here that we're actually in the minus, so not good. So now if you created expert advisors in the past and you've done your own optimization as well, you might be thinking, how is this any different to optimizing an expert advisor that has the MACD and exponential moving average coded within the expert advisor itself? Well, let me remind you that we have an indicator library, and how the expert advisor alongside the indicator library is set up is we can now optimize not only the indicator parameters such as the MACD and the exponential moving average parameters, but we can also optimize the indicators. And so why not, for this example, try optimizing the MACD with not just a exponential moving average with multiple periods, but why not a simple moving average or a weighted moving average or a smooth moving average? The options are almost endless. And fortunately enough, we've already got that coded up within our indicator library that we have grabbed from my GitHub. So all we need to do is specify within our enums for our filter one indicator, in this example, the different types of indicator options that we want to actually optimize. So let's go back into our expert advisor and start coding up our final bit of code, which is creating alternative indicators and indicator parameters for this particular expert advisor. So going back into Meta Editor, we can do our final update to the code and add in some more indicators. And this is where this becomes extremely powerful, because typically what we would do is code up a particular expert advisor and indicators within our expert advisor. And of course, we'd be stuck with that particular indicator set. Now, with our indicator library that we have coded up in our last tutorial, we're able to select any one of these indicators that we have coded up in our indicator library that we can utilize for our not only trading strategy, but also our optimization. So what I want to test is actually seeing which moving average is actually the better moving average for our expert advisor. So instead of just blindly relying on the exponential moving average to potentially give us the best results, what about the other moving averages that have been coded within our indicator library? So this is not something that we have gone through in our last tutorial. We simply coded up our exponential moving average. However, as mentioned in the last tutorial, I have provided the full code of my indicator library that I have currently coded up thus far within my GitHub, which is of course what we have downloaded and put into our indicator library that we created at the start of this tutorial. So what does that mean? That means we have the option to use any one of these indicators within our expert advisor, which is exactly what we're going to do. So all we need to do is add in the additional indicators within our indicator filter 1 enum section, which is as follows. So I've added in the following lines of code, which is very similar to the above. We have here our EMA, which we coded up previously for conditions B and the different periods for the exponential moving average. So I've copied that same convention and added in 4 more indicators or 4 more moving averages that the user and the optimizer can select. We've of course got the simple moving average with a period of 10 all the way up to 250. We've got a smoothed moving average, again from 10 to 250. We've got here a linear weighted moving average from 10 to 250. And we've got here a fractal adaptive moving average from 10 all the way up to 250. Now these are all moving averages which by default are provided by MetaTrader. There's no custom indicators that are being used here. So I'm going to compile this, and this compiles, and that actually completes the code for this particular expert advisor. Now it is literally that easy to add in indicators within the existing expert advisor, so that way we have the option to select, well, alternative indicators and indicator parameters. However, granted that we did already have that coded up within our indicator library that we grabbed from my GitHub. Now, of course, you can add to the indicator library yourself. And again, if you want to do that, then you will then have to follow along in my previous tutorial. And I will, just as a note, be updating the indicator library as I personally add in more indicators to the library. So make sure you keep an eye out on my GitHub, but also in my Discord, where I'll be informing everyone that I have done updates when I, well, get there. Now, as I mentioned, that was the last bit of code that we needed to do for this particular tutorial. So what better way to finish it off than by doing an optimization, not only for our MACD, but also for our moving averages and different moving average indicators and parameters that we have now added in. So let's go back into MetaTrader one last time and perform our final optimization. So now we are back within MetaTrader, and we have, of course, our expert advisor selected, and we also have our optimization selected again for slow complete algorithm, and we are optimizing for a maximum Sharpe ratio. If I go into the inputs are the same. However, we need to now adjust the stop for each of our input parameters. So we have not made any changes to our MACD. We're using the same MACD, so that remains the same. However, we have now added in several new moving averages, which I can select this drop down, and I can see quite an extensive list of moving averages here. So again, I don't know which moving average is going to provide me with the best results. I'm going to let the computer do the work for me. And so I'm going to go to the bottom, and I'm going to select the very last option, which is our fractal adaptive moving average. I'm going to select this. And now we can see here that there is 41 different options for our filter indicator or our moving average indicators, and a total of 287 different possible combinations of trading strategies using all of these options. I can of course do an optimization again on all 28 currency pairs using a fixed lot size of 0.1, and I can start the optimization. So if I toggle over to the optimization results, and I'm doing this live, we can watch this progress through, and we can see here that it's going through each of the different options relatively and extremely quickly, and it's complete. And we can see here that again, we have a total of 287 total indicator combinations, and we can see here the different results for each of those combinations. Notice here that for our input Enum F1, we've got a variety of different indicators now, not just the exponential moving averages, but different types of moving averages. We can see here that there is possible trends that the simple moving average and the smooth moving average seem to be performing the best. However, our drawdown is also suffering here as well. Nonetheless, we can see here that it is working quite fine. Out of curiosity, if I wanted to select what appears to be the best results, which I'll just select the top one, we can see here we're using a MACD of 5, 35, and 5, and the SMA B of 250. I can disable our optimization. I can go to inputs and do the following. So we've got our MACD 535.5, MACD 535.5, our smooth moving average of 250, smooth moving average of 250, and let's run a test, and that is our test. We can see here that it is a smoother equity curve in terms of balance. However, the actual equity drawdown is not that great. Again, this is probably not a trading strategy that I would actually necessarily trade. However, nonetheless, if we look at the results, we can see here that the results are in, and we have improved our net profit compared to previously when we started off this tutorial from using the default parameters, although taking opposite trades, of the MACD and exponential moving average. We have now optimized this trading strategy and found the best possible results. Just one thing to note here, that you can actually double click and run a back test straight from the optimization window. So if I wanted to test this one here, which has a slightly less drawdown, I double clicked on that and that would run the optimization. However, just to note, if I go back to the inputs, we can see here that the tradable symbols does get cut off here, and it actually doesn't test all tradable symbols. If I go back to the backtesting result, symbols is showing 9. Now, for whatever reason, when you do double click this and it takes you back to the input section, it does cut off some of the string. So all you need to do is repaste in your all tradable symbols and then now run the backtest. And that has now run the backtest on 28 currency pairs. And we can see the results here as follows. Now that is our Expert Advisor tested and optimized, and I hope you can now see the value of having this type of Expert Advisor alongside with our indicator library setup. However, I want to mention that our Expert Advisor and our indicator library is no silver bullet or holy grail. Just like any backtester or optimization process, there is a tendency for overfitting. And therefore, when using this Expert Advisor or indicator library, then I would recommend that you follow appropriate methodologies to avoid overfitting as much as possible, such as in-sample, out-of-sample testing, walk-forward analysis, or even using synthetic data to do your testing. Now, I also wouldn't recommend blindly putting in all of the indicators within the indicator library in the Expert Advisor and doing one massive optimization, because you might have 100,000 or even a million different types of strategies and combinations of indicators, and that is literally what is called data mining. And although that is a legitimate way to find profitable trading strategies, it does come with advanced methodologies when performing that type of testing. Now, what does that mean using this indicator library and Expert Advisor moving forward? Well, what I'm personally going to be doing is adding more indicators to the indicator library and start to test alternative trading strategies using this particular expert advisor, the methods that I've shown you just today, and using the optimization process with alternative types of trading strategies. For example, a Bollinger Band strategy or a Donchian channel strategy. The options are almost endless. And once again, as we've discussed in our previous tutorial, once you do the codes for those particular indicators that you want to add in once, you don't have to do them again. You just reference to the indicator library and the code's already there, which is a super big benefit. The other thing that I'll also be doing is testing which indicators perform the best, mainly being a main confirmation indicator, or in this example, our entry 1 trigger indicator. And what we can do here is actually data mine which indicators and indicator parameters actually perform the best relative to other indicators for particularly entry type of indicators. And if you are a no-nonsense Forex trader in this example, which I know a lot of people that follow my channel are, well, this is our main confirmation indicator. So that's something that I'll be exploring at a later date. So for those no-nonsense Forex traders, if there's any confirmation 1 indicators that you would like me to explore, then leave a comment down below and I'll be more than happy to include them in a future test. So I really hope you enjoyed today's tutorial, and I hope it's given you some insight in terms of what is possible within MetaTrader, particularly using this expert advisor and indicator library. Again, this is something that I haven't really seen on YouTube or the interwebs, and admittedly, again, I haven't really explored the internet to see if someone else has really done this. It's just something that came to mind and I made up. So I'm personally actually really proud to be sharing with you what I have developed, which is this particular expert advisor and indicator library combination. And again, if you haven't watched my previous tutorials, and I do recommend watching them so that way you can go in there and add in your very own indicators in the indicator library, or code up alternative expert advisors with different types of indicator strategies within the expert advisor itself. I do recommend watching my previous tutorials. So with all that being said, I really hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. I hope it's given you some insight and something to play around with. Happy trading, happy coding, and I will see you in the next videos.